The horse came to a stop at the edge of the ridge, and Ira Carver sat in the saddle like a man who had ridden straight out of a bad dream and into something he did not have the language to name. Below him, the valley of Callen Hollow spread out in the late afternoon sun, and it was not the valley he had left. It was not the broken, dusty, half-dead stretch of scrubland he had ridden away from 6 years ago with a warrant on his name and a hollow space behind his sternum where something good used to live. This valley was alive. The wheat fields ran long and gold in the September wind of 1884. There was a proper schoolhouse where the old collapsed barn had been. There was a church with white paint that had not yet faded. There was a mill turning slowly at the creek bend. There were people walking the main road of what was now, apparently, an actual town, not the ghost of one. Ira's jaw tightened until it ached. He had come back because he believed there was nothing left here worth protecting, which meant there was nothing left here he could ruin. He had come back because he was tired of running, and because the warrant had finally been cleared 3 months ago by a territorial judge who had looked at the evidence and found it laughable. He had come back because he was 31 years old and he had nowhere else in the world that had ever felt like a place, and sometimes a man needed a place even if the place had given him nothing but grief the last time he stood in it. He had not come back expecting this. He had not come back expecting her. He saw Evelyn Barrett before she saw him, which was the only mercy the universe offered him in that moment. She was standing in front of what had once been the derelict trading post at the center of the hollow, and was now a well-built general store with a hand-painted sign above the door. She was in conversation with 2 men in work clothes, holding a ledger in one arm and gesturing with the other, clearly explaining something with the kind of calm authority that made the 2 men nod and not argue. Her dark hair was pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat. Her dress was practical cotton, faded blue, the kind you wore when you intended to work hard and did not care who thought less of you for it. She looked like a woman who had built something. She looked like a woman who had built everything around her, in fact, and who knew exactly how heavy every single board of it had been. Ira felt the betrayal before he could stop it. Not a real betrayal, he knew that even as it hit him. She owed him nothing. She had owed him nothing the day he left. But the feeling came anyway, dark and specific, the feeling of a man who had pictured a ruin for 6 years and used the image of it to punish himself, only to find that the ruin had not waited politely for his return. It had become something. It had become something without him. And the worst part, the part that sat like a coal in his chest, was that some deeply foolish corner of his heart had always believed that if he ever came back, she would still be there waiting in the rubble of the life he had walked away from. She was not in the rubble. She had built a town. He pulled his horse back from the ridge before she could look up and see the silhouette of a man she had every reason to never want to see again. His hands were not steady. He breathed through his nose and stared at the darkening sky above the distant hills and told himself, with great conviction, that he should turn around right now. He should ride back out of this valley the same way he had ridden in, which was quietly and without permission, and he should leave her and everything she had made here completely alone. He told himself that for about 3 full minutes. Then he rode down into the valley anyway. 6 years earlier, in the spring of 1878, Ira Carver had been 25 years old and working his father's small cattle operation at the south end of Callen Hollow alongside his younger brother Declan. The hollow had been struggling then. The town that should have grown up around the creek settlement had never quite taken root, mostly because the land had been under the shadow of a man named Clyde Morse, who ran the largest operation in the region, and who had a habit of absorbing smaller ranches through methods that were legal just often enough to be difficult to fight. Ira's father had died of a lung sickness the previous winter, leaving the operation to Ira with debts attached that should not have existed, debts Ira later understood had been manufactured by Morse to position himself for a forced purchase. Evelyn Barrett had come to the Hollow that spring, 22 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Kansas who had himself died recently, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, a box of books, and the kind of iron-spined determination that tends to grow in people who have had everything taken from them young. She had come because she had heard there was land available, and because she had a small amount of money saved from 2 years of teaching in Dodge City, and because she believed, with the kind of faith that is almost infuriating to witness, that a place that was struggling was not a place that was lost. It was just a place that needed someone to believe in it hard enough. She had taken up residence in the old trading post, which the previous owner had abandoned, and she had begun running it as a supply stop for travelers on the Eastern Trail. Within 6 weeks, she had the place clean and stocked and turning a modest profit. Within 3 months, she had convinced 2 other families who had been considering leaving the Hollow to stay, by the simple method of being reliable and fair, and making it known that she intended to be there for the long term. Ira had met her at the creek on a Tuesday in late May. He had been mending a section of fence that ran along the water, and she had come to fill 2 large jugs because the well she had dug behind the trading post had turned slightly brackish. He had offered to help her carry the jugs back. She had told him she could manage. He had said he knew that, and he helped anyway. She had looked at him sideways the whole walk back with an expression that said she was deciding something, and by the time they reached the trading post, she had apparently decided that he was acceptable, because she invited him in for coffee, and they talked for 3 hours about the Hollow and what it could be and what was standing in the way of what it could be. And by the end of it, Ira had felt something shift inside him at a fundamental level, the way tectonic plates shift. Slow and permanent and impossible to reverse. They had been together for a year before the trouble with Morse came to its ugly head. Ira had found evidence that Morse had been altering land documents at the county office, forging signatures, creating false liens against the smaller properties in the Hollow. He had taken that evidence to the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Price, who was, it turned out, entirely in the pocket of Clyde Morse. Price had arrested Ira instead, on charges of theft and assault that had been filed by Morse, and that were so thoroughly fabricated they would have been laughable if Price had not been the one holding the keys to the jail. The night before he was to be transferred to the territorial prison, Ira had escaped. A deputy had been careless with a ring of keys, and Ira had not been in a position to be noble about it. He had ridden out of Callen Hollow in the dark with nothing but his horse and the cold knowledge that leaving was the only choice that did not end in a prison sentence built on lies. He had not gone back to the trading post. He had not said goodbye. He had not left a letter. He had made the decision that he was protecting her by disappearing, that involving her in his flight would only bring Morse's attention and Price's cruelty down on her head, and he had believed that with enough conviction to ride 300 miles before the sun came up twice. He had believed it for 6 years. He had repeated it to himself like a prayer in 100 different camps and way stations across Arizona and New Mexico, every time the thought of her face surfaced in the dark. He had built the decision into the architecture of his own conscience and called it noble. He had called it sacrifice. He had called it protection. Riding down into the Hollow now, past the wheat fields and the new fences and the well-kept properties, he was beginning to understand that what he had called sacrifice might have been, at least in part, cowardice. Not entirely. There had been real danger. Morse had been a real threat. But the part where he had not found a way to get word to her, the part where he had let her sit in the Hollow not knowing if he was alive or dead, the part where he had trusted his own judgment about what was best for her without once asking her, that part was harder to call noble now that he was looking at what she had built without him and understanding, all at once, how very capable she had always been of handling things. The town had a name now. There was a small painted sign at the edge of the main road, Callen, Colorado Territory, Est 1881. She had incorporated the town. She had actually done it. He tied his horse at the rail in front of the general store, which was her store. He could see it now up close. It had her name on the secondary sign near the door, Barrett's Supply and Dry Goods. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment with his hat in his hands, and he was aware that he was a man with a dark past standing at the door of a future he had no right to, and that the decent thing, the truly decent thing, would still be to turn around. The door opened outward, and Evelyn Barrett walked through it and stopped when she was 2 feet away from him. The ledger was still in her arm. Her hat was pushed back slightly from the conversation she had been having. Her dark eyes met his, and for 3 full seconds there was nothing, no expression, just the absolute stillness of a person whose entire nervous system has stopped to process something catastrophic. Then something moved behind her eyes. Something complicated and layered and old, the way feelings get when they have been sitting in a person for a long time and have had years to ferment into something more complex than they started out. She said his name, just his name, Ira. The way she said it was not a greeting. It was not happy. It was not angry either, not exactly, though anger was certainly in the mixture. It sounded more like the way a person says the name of something they had believed was gone and have just been confronted with proof that it was not. He said, Evelyn. He watched her put the complicated thing behind her eyes back behind glass. He watched her straighten her spine and tighten her grip on the ledger and become, in the space of 4 seconds, the composed and capable woman he had just watched directing 2 hired men from a ridge above the valley, instead of the woman whose name he had said in the dark to no one for 6 years. She said, "You should come inside." He did. The general store was well organized and smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and sawdust in proportions that were exactly right for a general store. There were shelves of dry goods, bolts of fabric, tools, seeds, canned goods from St. Louis, a barrel of flour and a barrel of sugar, a glass case with small luxuries. There was a counter with a ledger stand and a small oil lamp. Behind the counter stood a girl of about 15, clearly a hired helper, who looked at Ira with open curiosity and then looked at Evelyn with the kind of question in her eyes that she was too polite to say aloud. Evelyn said to the girl, whose name turned out to be Marta, "I'll be in the back office for a few minutes." "Hold the counter." Marta nodded and held the counter. Evelyn led Ira through a door behind the shelves and into a small room that served as her office and stockroom combined. There was a desk covered in papers, a filing cabinet, a small wood stove, 2 chairs. She set the ledger on the desk. She did not sit down. She stood with her back to the desk and her arms crossed over her chest, and she looked at him the way you look at something that requires a decision, and you are not yet ready to make it. Ira stayed near the door. He said, "I know what you're thinking," she said. "I very much doubt that," he said. "You're thinking I have some nerve showing up here after 6 years without warning." She said, "That is the charitable version of what I'm thinking, yes." He put his hat on the edge of the nearest chair. He said, "The warrant was cleared in June. Territorial judge named Harriman reviewed the Morse case and found the original charges fraudulent. Morse is in prison in Denver. Price lost his badge 2 years ago when the territorial marshal's office looked into his records." He paused. "I had nowhere else to go that made any sense." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You had nowhere else to go, so you came back to where you had been." She was quiet again. "Not because of me." He looked at the floor. He said, "Partly because of you, mostly because of you. But I didn't know how to say that without it sounding like I expected something from you, and I didn't want to come back expecting something." She said, "What you did was cruel, Ira. I know you thought it was protection. I know you thought you were keeping me out of something dangerous. But you left in the middle of the night, and you didn't send a single word in 6 years to tell me you were alive. I spent 3 months believing Price's men had caught you and put you in the ground somewhere off the road." The weight of that hit him clean through. He had not thought about the 3 months. He had thought about the danger and the distance and the warrant. He had not thought about her standing in this hollow in the winter of 1878 not knowing if he was dead. He said, "I'm sorry. That is not enough. I know it isn't enough, but I am truly sorry for that. She looked at the wall above his shoulder. Her jaw worked. She said, I was furious with you for about 2 years. The kind of furious that makes you want to burn things down. And then I realized that if I stayed furious, Morse was going to win, because if I was busy being furious and grieving, I wasn't going to do anything useful, and this Hollow had already lost too many people to Morse's schemes. So I stopped being furious. She looked back at him. I didn't forgive you. I just stopped letting it use up my energy. He nodded. He said, What happened with Morse? After I left, she said, Sit down. This is going to take a little while. He sat. After he had left in the autumn of 1878, Evelyn had spent those dark months doing exactly what she told him she had done, holding herself together through work, through purpose, through the trading post that needed running regardless of what was happening to her heart. But she had also done something else. She had not simply survived Morse's pressure. She had started fighting back in the way a woman in 1878 with no legal standing, no male relatives, and no powerful connections had to fight, carefully, quietly, and with an enormous amount of documentation. She had begun keeping records of every pressure tactic Morse used against the remaining families in the Hollow. She had written down dates and names and specific threats and amounts. She had done this in a small notebook that she kept under a loose floorboard because she knew that if Morse or Price got hold of it, there would be consequences. And the consequences available to them in this territory for a woman who was causing trouble were deeply unpleasant to contemplate. In early 1880, a new territorial marshal had been appointed, a man named Duncan Webb, who had come into the region specifically to investigate allegations of land fraud that had been accumulating from multiple settlements. Evelyn had contacted him through a letter delivered by a traveler passing through the Hollow toward the territorial capital at Pueblo. She had sent copies of her notebook. She had given Webb names and dates. Webb had launched an investigation. The investigation had taken 18 months. In the summer of 1881, Clyde Morse had been arrested, along with Price and 2 county officials who had been facilitating the document fraud. The properties that had been illegally seized or pressured into sale had begun the long process of either being returned or compensated, and in the space created by Morse's removal, the Hollow had finally been able to grow. Evelyn had pushed for incorporation immediately. She had organized the remaining families. She had written to the Territorial Land Office. She had drafted the petition herself, had gotten every adult resident of the Hollow to sign it, and had ridden to Pueblo with it personally on a 2-day journey on horseback. The town of Callen had been formally incorporated in September of 1881, with Evelyn Barrett as its first elected mayor, a position she held until 1883, when she stepped down to focus on expanding the store and the mill that she had built with 2 other partners at the Creek Bend. Ira sat in the chair in the back office of the general store and listened to all of this and felt something building in his chest that was a mixture of pride and shame and the particular anguish of a man who understands, all at once, that the person he loves has not been waiting for him and has been better off for not waiting. He said, "You were the mayor," she said. "For 2 years, yes." He said, "Of course you were." She looked at him sharply, trying to read whether he meant that as a dismissal. She must have found something in his face that answered her question because she uncrossed her arms and pulled the second chair out from the desk and sat down. She said, "Why did you really come back, Ira? Not the cleared warrant, not the having nowhere to go. The real reason." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Because I have spent 6 years riding around the West trying to build something that felt like it mattered, and nothing I touched felt like it mattered the way this place did. The way you did. And I knew the warrant was cleared, and I knew you had no reason to want anything from me, but I needed to at least stand in the same piece of ground as you and say I was sorry to your face. That was what I told myself," she said. "And now that you've said it to my face," he said, "now I don't know what to do with myself." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the office door, they could hear Marta talking cheerfully to a customer, the sounds of the store going on around them. The mundane, functional sounds of a life that had been built and was running. Evelyn said, "There is a boarding house at the north end of the main road. Mrs. Pellman runs it. It's clean and reasonably priced, and she doesn't ask too many questions." She stood. "I'm not ready to have the rest of this conversation. I need a few days." She picked up her ledger. "I'm not telling you to leave the valley, but I'm not telling you to stay either. That is your decision to make, same as it was before." The slight weight of that last sentence was not lost on him. He nodded. He picked up his hat. He said, "Thank you for hearing me out." She said, "I didn't do it for you. I did it for me. There is a difference." He left the store. He found Mrs. Pellman's boarding house. He took the room. He lay on the clean, narrow bed in the last light of the September afternoon and stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman who had built a town while he was building nothing in particular. And he understood, with complete clarity, that if he was going to have any kind of right to be here, he was going to have to prove he could be useful to what she had made rather than a threat to it. The next morning he was up before dawn. He found the livery at the south edge of town and spoke to the man who ran it, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Samuel Holt, who looked at Ira with the frank assessment of a person who has learned to be careful about strangers. Ira said, "I'm looking for work. I'm good with horses, good with tools, reasonable with carpentry, and I know cattle. I'm not looking to take charity. I want to earn my keep." Samuel Holt said, "You got a name?" Ira said, "Ira Carver." Something shifted on Samuel's face. Ira watched him file that name and decide something. Samuel said, "I know that name." Ira said, "A lot of people do for various reasons. The warrant attached to it was cleared 3 months ago by Judge Harriman in Pueblo. If you want to send a wire to verify that, I'll wait." Samuel looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "I don't need to wire anyone. Evelyn Barrett told me once that you were the man who first found evidence against Morse and tried to bring it to Price, that you got arrested for it." Ira said, "That is accurate." Samuel said, "Could have used a man like that around here a few years back." Ira said, "I know." Samuel said, "I've got more work than I can manage alone right now. I've got 12 horses to shoe by Thursday and a new stall block to frame up. Can you start this morning?" Ira said, "I'll start right now." He worked hard that first week. He worked the way a man works when he is trying to demonstrate something, when labor is also argument. He was at the livery by sunup and stayed until the light went. He shoed horses and mended harness and helped frame the new stall block and did it without complaint and without drama. Word spread in the way word spreads in small towns, which is immediately and with slight embellishment but a broadly accurate core. There was a man working at the livery, a former outlaw, the one from before Morse came down, and he was working hard and keeping to himself, and he had known Evelyn Barrett once. He saw Evelyn twice that week, both times briefly. Once on the road when she was walking from the store to the mill and he was carrying lumber from the saw yard. She had nodded at him. He had nodded back. The second time she came into the livery to check on a mare that had thrown a shoe, and he had been the one who found the problem and repaired it, and she had looked at his work critically, and then said it was good, and their hands had been 4 inches apart on the rail of the stall for approximately 10 seconds before she stepped back and thanked Samuel and left. At the end of the first week, he was at the boarding house eating supper when a man he had not seen before came and sat across the table from him. The man was perhaps 40, well-dressed for a frontier town, with the groomed precision of someone who was trying to look like wealth without quite having it. He introduced himself as Gerald Hennessy and said he was a land agent recently arrived from Denver who was looking at investment opportunities in the Callen area. Ira was polite. He was eating his supper, and he was tired, and he was not immediately suspicious, because sometimes a land agent was just a land agent. But then Hennessy said, "I understand the valley has been consolidated under a fairly informal arrangement since the Morse prosecution. A lot of the land titles are still in process. There could be opportunities for a smart investor to pick up some of those titles before they're fully settled." and Ira felt something cold and specific run up the back of his neck. He said, "What kind of investor?" Hennessy said. "Someone with resources and vision. Someone who could see that this valley is producing now in ways it wasn't before, and who could position himself to benefit from that production at scale." Ira put down his fork. He said carefully, "The land titles in this valley are in the process of being returned to the families they were taken from. That process is being managed by the Territorial Land Office and by the people who live here. I don't think there's an opportunity for the kind of thing you're describing," Hennessy said. "There's always an opportunity if you know how to structure a deal." Ira looked at him. He said, "You should talk to Evelyn Barrett before you talk to anyone else in this valley. She is the person you want to have that conversation with." Hennessy smiled. He said, "I already have a meeting with her scheduled for Monday." Ira went back to his supper. But after Hennessy left the table, he sat for a long time thinking about the conversation, and the more he thought about it, the more the specific phrasing nagged at him. Picking up titles before they were fully settled. Positioning himself to benefit from production at scale. He had heard those kinds of phrases before. He had heard them from men who worked for Clyde Morse. He did not want to go to Evelyn with a concern based on one dinner conversation and his own instincts, which she had reasonable grounds to mistrust. But he also could not in good conscience say nothing and let Monday come without at least raising the question. On Sunday evening he walked to the general store, which was closed, but there was a light in the window above it, which was where Evelyn lived. He knocked at the side door. There was a wait, then footsteps on stairs. Then Evelyn opened the door, still dressed but with her hair down and a book in her hand, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been expecting an evening of quiet reading and was now recalibrating. She said, "Ira," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday. I need to tell you something about a man named Gerald Hennessy." She went very still. She stepped back from the door to let him in. He sat at her small kitchen table on the ground floor behind the store, and she made coffee without being asked, and he told her everything about the dinner conversation. He told her the phrasing that had stuck with him. He told her he might be wrong and might be seeing ghosts of things that weren't there, but he wanted her to know before her Monday meeting. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set her coffee cup down very precisely and said, "Hennessy came to me with a letter of introduction from a banking concern in Denver. I checked the bank's registration and it appeared legitimate." Ira said, "Can you check who the investors in that bank are?" She looked at him. She said, "I can try. The territorial banking records are public, but they take time to pull." He said, "Do you trust the territorial marshal's office now?" "Under Webb," she said. "Webb retired last year. His replacement is a man named Calloway who I have met twice and have no serious complaints about." He said, "I could wire Calloway first thing Monday before your meeting with Hennessy. I could ask about the banking concern." She looked at him across the small kitchen table for a moment. It was the first time they had been truly alone and still since he arrived, without the distraction of the store around them or the business of the livery to give the moment a shape. The lamp on the table was warm and low. Her hair was down and the book she had been reading was on the counter, and she looked, in this particular light, like the woman he had been talking to in his head for 6 years, and the feeling of that was almost unbearable. She said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because I don't want what happened before to happen to this town, to what you built." She said, "That's a good answer. It's also not the only answer." He said, "No, it's not the only answer." She held his gaze. The lamp flickered once. She said, "Send the wire Monday morning. I'll push the meeting with Hennessy to Tuesday." She picked up her coffee again. "Stay and finish your coffee." He stayed and finished his coffee. They talked, not about the past and not about feelings, but about the town. She told him about the mill project and the plans for a second well on the north side to better service the growing residential area. She told him about the school, which now had an actual school teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Clara Dwight, who was doing excellent work with the 23 children enrolled. She told him about the church, which had been built by the community collectively on 3 Saturdays in the summer of 1882, and which still needed a proper organ but managed fine with a fiddle player on Sundays. He told her about where he had been. He told her about New Mexico, about working cattle drives for 3 years, about the brief and deeply miserable winter he had spent in a mining camp outside Leadville trying to make honest money at the silver, about the 2 years he had spent as a horse trader in Arizona, which had been the most financially stable period of his adult life, but which had felt hollow in the specific way that financial stability feels hollow when you are doing it alone with no particular purpose beyond the thing itself. She listened the way she always had listened, which was entirely, not waiting for her turn to speak, actually receiving what he was saying. When the coffee was done, she said, "It's late," and he stood and thanked her for the time and put on his hat and went to the door. She came to see him out, and in the doorway she said quietly, "I'm glad you're not dead, Ira." He said, "I'm glad about that too, Evelyn." She almost smiled. He could see it almost happen at the corner of her mouth. Then she said good night and closed the door, and he walked back through the quiet town in the dark with the feeling of a man who has just been told something important in a language he is still learning to read. Monday morning he sent the wire to Marshall Calloway. Tuesday morning, the reply came back and it was not nothing. The banking concern Hennessy had cited was registered in Denver. That part was accurate, but 2 of its 3 principal investors were business associates of a man named Rayfield Morse, who was the younger brother of Clyde Morse, who was currently serving his sentence in the Denver prison. Ira was at the general store before Evelyn had opened for the morning. He showed her the wire. She read it twice. Her face did something careful and contained that he recognized as the look she made when she was angry and was choosing not to show it because showing it would not be useful. She said, "Rayfield Morse." She said it the way you say the name of a disease you thought you had survived. She said he is trying to do exactly what his brother did but more quietly, using land titles still in process as the entry point. Ira said, "That is my read of it," she said. "I have a meeting with Hennessy in 40 minutes. He said, "Do you want me there?" She looked at him. She said, "Yes, but not at the table, at the counter. Marta can be in the back." Hennessy arrived exactly on time, which was itself a sign of something. People with genuinely casual intentions tended to be a little late. He came into the general store and found Evelyn Barrett at the counter, ledger open, composed and pleasant and entirely unreadable. He found Ira Carver at the far end of the counter, apparently doing inventory of a shelf of hardware goods, with his back mostly turned. Hennessy did not appear to recognize Ira from their brief introduction at the boarding house dinner, or if he did, he decided it was irrelevant. He sat across the counter from Evelyn, and he presented his proposal, which was, as Ira had suspected, a scheme to purchase, through the banking concern, the outstanding land titles in the valley at below-market prices during the period of legal processing, effectively inserting a financial intermediary between the Territorial Land Office and the original families to whom the land should have been returned. Evelyn listened to the whole proposal. Then she placed the wire from Marshall Calloway on the counter, face up, and slid it toward Hennessy. She said, "I want you to read this before you continue." He read it. The color in his face changed. He said, "This is a misunderstanding." She said, "I don't believe that it is." He said, "The Morse family name is attached to the bank as a historical investment matter. It has no bearing on current operations." She said, "Marshall Calloway disagrees. As does the letter I have already sent him this morning, requesting an inquiry into the banking concern's current operations." She folded her hands on the counter. "I want you to leave Callen, Mr. Hennessy, and I want you to carry a clear message back to whoever sent you. This valley is incorporated. It has a land office, a marshal on notice, and a community of people who have already spent 6 years fighting this exact kind of scheme. The next attempt will not be a wire. It will be a formal complaint to the territorial attorney." Hennessy stood. He was trying to look unaffected and was not quite managing it. He said, You're making an enemy of powerful people." She said, "Those people have been my enemies since 1878. I have had time to get comfortable with that." He left. Ira came away from the hardware shelf and stood at the counter. He looked at Evelyn, who was looking at the door through which Hennessy had just departed, and her hands were completely flat and still on the counter, a studied stillness, and he knew her well enough to understand that she was processing the fear she had not allowed herself to show. He said quietly, "You were remarkable," she said, still looking at the door. "He will actually come back, or someone like him will." Ira said, "Yes, but now Calloway knows and there is a paper trail. It is much harder to run the same scheme twice once it has been documented." She turned and looked at him. She said, "You spotted him before I would have, at the boarding house." She paused. "I might have walked into that Tuesday meeting without knowing what I was walking into," he said. "You would have figured it out," she said, "maybe, but not in time." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Ira." The way she said it this time was different from the previous thank you she had given him, which had been the kind of thank you that maintains professional distance. This one was quieter and more direct and came with eye contact that lasted a beat longer than strictly necessary. He said, "Of course." The autumn deepened. The air in the valley turned that particular Colorado clear that comes in October, with frost on the grass in the mornings and afternoons that were still warm enough to work in shirt sleeves. Ira continued his work at the livery. Samuel Holt, who was not the kind of man who needed to understand a full situation before deciding whether he liked a person, had decided he liked Ira within about 4 days of their first meeting, and had begun treating him with the casual generosity of a man who considers someone a colleague. Ira also began doing small jobs around the town that needed doing and had no clear owner. There was a section of the road at the creek crossing that flooded badly in rain and needed a proper grading. He spent 3 days on that, borrowing tools from the livery and getting help from 2 of Samuel's occasional laborers. There was a broken shutter on the schoolhouse that had been banging in the wind for 2 weeks. He fixed it between morning chores and lunch. He did these things without announcing them and without asking for credit, and the town noticed anyway, because small towns always notice. Clara Dwight, the schoolteacher, stopped him on the road one afternoon to thank him for the shutter and to tell him that her students had been singing a song about it for 2 days that she found both charming and slightly maddening. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in what felt like a very long time, and it surprised him slightly, the ease of it. He and Evelyn fell into a rhythm. It was not the rhythm of what they had been before. It was something more careful, more considered, something built out of awareness of how badly things had gone the last time, and how much she had in this valley that she could not afford to damage by rushing into something messy. They talked at the store when he came in for supplies. They had 2 more Sunday evening kitchen table conversations, both initiated by her, which he understood was significant. He did not push. He did not assume. He was acutely aware that he was operating on her terms entirely, and he was grateful for even that much. One evening she showed him the notebook, the one she had kept during the Morse years, the dates and names and threatened amounts. She took it out of the filing cabinet in the back office and set it on the desk between them and said, "This is how it happened. This is what I used to bring Webb in." He looked at the pages. Her handwriting, careful and dense, 6 months of a secret record kept at personal risk. He said, "You were brave for doing this," she said. "I was terrified every day I was doing it. Being brave and being terrified are not mutually exclusive." He said, "No, they aren't," she said. "I was angry at you for a long time, partly because I wanted to tell you about this as I was building it, and you weren't there. Every time I found a new piece of evidence I wanted to tell you." She closed the notebook. That was the loneliest part, not the danger, the not being able to tell you. The directness of that hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He said, "I think about that a lot. The things I didn't know were happening to you while I was trying to protect you from them." She said, "I didn't need protection, Ira. I needed a partner." He said, "I know that now." She looked at him across the desk. She said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes, with absolute certainty." She looked at him for a long moment, Then she said, "I should not have had to build all of this alone." He said, "No, you shouldn't have, and I am sorry." He held her gaze. "I am not asking you to change what you built or how you built it. I am not asking you to make room for me in something that is yours. What I am asking, the only thing I am asking, is whether there is any version of this, any version at all, where I get to be near you while you go on building it." The silence after that was the particular kind of silence in which a very important decision is being made. Evelyn said, "There might be." He let himself breathe. He said, "That is more than I deserve." She said, "Yes, it is." But she was looking at him with something that was beginning to be, carefully and cautiously, something like warmth. October turned into November. The first real snow came in the second week of November, 2 inches overnight that made the valley look like it had been covered in paper. Ira was at the store first thing to make sure the boardwalk in front was cleared, which it already was, because Evelyn had been up at dawn with a shovel. But he helped anyway, and she let him, and they worked side by side in the cold morning air without saying very much, and it was companionable in a way that felt like progress. The Hennessy situation resolved itself quietly. Calloway's inquiry into the banking concern turned up enough irregularities that the Denver Banking Board revoked its charter in November. Rayfield Morse, when contacted by Calloway's office, was apparently unable to produce documentation to counter the inquiry's findings. The threat to the valley's land titles evaporated, and the Territorial Land Office confirmed in December that the remaining outstanding titles would be processed and issued by the following spring. Ira was at the general store when the letter confirming this arrived. He was there because Evelyn had taken to giving him small jobs around the store and the attached storeroom, shelving, repairs, the occasional delivery, things he was glad to do because they meant being there. She read the letter twice and then looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears exactly, but was the precursor to them, the brightness of relief so large it has nowhere to go. She said, "It's done." He said, "It's done," she said, "all of it. All of those families are going to have their land back properly, legally, and there is nothing Rayfield Morse or anyone like him can do about it." He crossed the small space between them in the back office, and she did not step back. He put his arms around her carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of breaking, and she leaned into it, her forehead against his shoulder, and they stood like that for a long moment in the back office of the store she had built, with the December cold pressing against the windows and the sound of Marta cheerfully talking to a customer on the other side of the door. She said, her voice quiet against his shoulder, "I missed you. Even when I was furious with you, even when I had decided I was fine and didn't need you, I missed you." He said, "I missed you every single day." She pulled back enough to look at him. She said, "If you leave again, Ira, you will not find me waiting." He said, "I will not leave again, I swear to you. I am done with going. There is nothing out there worth more than this." She looked at him steadily, reading him the way she always had, looking for the truth behind the words. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she reached up and put her palm against his jaw and she kissed him, just once, brief and deliberate, the kind of kiss that is both a beginning and a question. And when she pulled back, she was looking at him with something that had come fully out from behind the glass now, warm and real and no longer defended. She said, "Stay for supper." He said, "I'll stay for supper." December in Callen was a social affair. It turned out, in the way that small towns that have recently survived something collectively tend to make a celebration of their survival. There was a Christmas gathering at the church that the entire town attended, with Clara Dwight organizing the children into a pageant of moderate theatrical ambition and considerable enthusiasm, and with fiddle music and food brought communally, and a general warmth that comes from people who have chosen to be in a place together and know exactly what that choice has cost. Ira was there as Evelyn's acknowledged companion, which was a status he had arrived at gradually enough that he was not entirely sure when it had become official, but which felt completely natural by the time they were standing together in the church doorway, watching the snow come down on the town she had built and the lives it contained. Samuel Holt shook his hand that evening with genuine feeling and said, "Glad you're here, Carver." Clara Dwight, who was young and warm and had heard enough of the story by now to have developed strong opinions about it, said to Ira privately near the refreshments table, "For what it's worth, she talked about you twice in the 2 years I have known her. Both times in the context of things she wished had been different. That kind of talking means something," he said. "I know," she said. "Good." In January, when the valley was deep in winter and the work was slower, Ira and Evelyn began to truly talk, not the careful conversations of October and November, which had been real but had been moving around the larger subject. Now they talked fully, sitting at her kitchen table with the stove going and coffee between them, or the occasional glass of brandy she kept in the cabinet for cold evenings, and they said the things that had been waiting 6 years to be said. He told her about the night he had escaped from Price's jail. He told her exactly what had gone through his mind, and he did not defend his choice to leave without telling her. He said it plainly. He had been afraid, not only of being caught, but of what Price might do to her if Ira was associated with her, and the fear had made him make a decision that was not his alone to make, and that was the real wrong of it, that he had decided for her rather than letting her be part of the decision. She listened. She said, "I understand why you did it. I even think there was some real reasoning in it. Price was capable of terrible things." She was quiet. "But I am not a person who needs to be protected from her own choices. I would have helped you, Ira. Even knowing the risk, because you were worth the risk to me," he said. "I know that now," she said. "You have to actually believe it, not just say you know it. You have to believe that I am capable of deciding for myself what risks I am willing to take for someone I love." He heard the word love used plainly and without deflection, and it went through him like warm water. He said, "I believe it, completely and without reservation." She looked at him across the table. She said, "Good. Because I am very good at deciding what is worth the risk to me, and you are still on that list, which should tell you something about my judgment, since I am generally considered to have excellent judgment." He started laughing. She started laughing. It was the particular laughter of two people who have been through something difficult and are now, carefully, on the other side of it, and the laugh had 6 years of pressure behind it and came out bright and real and entirely unguarded. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his back. He said, "Evelyn Barrett, I am completely in love with you. I have been for a long time, and I will be for a considerably longer time, and I would like, if you are willing, to spend whatever time you will give me proving that I understand now what I did not understand before." She said, "I am also in love with you. I find it deeply inconvenient, and have found it so for most of the past 6 years." She paused. "You may spend that time as described. I suggest starting immediately, as you have already used up a considerable amount of it." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles. She watched him do it with those dark eyes that had seen 6 years of things he had not seen and were still, somehow, looking at him like he was worth looking at. The valley came out of winter slowly and beautifully, the way Colorado valleys do, the snow retreating up the slopes as March turned to April, the creek running high and cold with the melt, the fields going from brown to the first extraordinary green that comes with the new grass. The land titles were issued in March as promised. There was a gathering at the church to acknowledge it, a smaller and more serious gathering than Christmas had been, where the families received their documents and Marshal Calloway made a brief and plain-spoken speech about the importance of clean land law, and the territorial attorney sent a letter that Clara Dwight read aloud, because her speaking voice was better than anyone else in town's. Evelyn stood at the back of the church and watched her neighbors receive what was theirs, what had always been theirs, and Ira stood beside her, their shoulders touching, and she did not wipe the tears when they came. She just let them happen, because there was no one here she needed to be composed for. By spring, Ira had his own small operation going. He had bought, from a family who was consolidating their land, a 12-acre parcel at the east end of the valley with an old but structurally sound farmhouse and a good barn. He had bought it with the money from 2 years of Arizona horse trading, which he had been carrying around in a bank in Pueblo for want of anything sensible to do with it, and which turned out to be almost exactly the right amount to secure the parcel and have some left over for improvements. He ran horses. Not a large operation. 6 breeding mares and a stallion he had brought up from a contact in New Mexico, with the intention of producing quality working horses for the ranchers and farmers in and around the valley. He had a good eye and he knew horses deeply, in the particular way that men develop knowledge of things they have worked alongside for years, and within a season the quality of his horses was establishing itself by word of mouth in the surrounding area. He also continued doing things for the town. He built the grading project he had started at the creek crossing properly, with Samuel's help and 2 other men, and the flooding problem at that road section was solved for the first time since the town had been a town. He helped build an addition to the school when the enrollment grew. He was not the mayor, and he was not the founder, and he was not trying to be either of those things. He was just a man who had come back to a place and found it worth taking care of. Evelyn watched all of this with the measured appreciation of a woman who had been the one doing all of it alone for long enough that watching someone else do some of it was a genuine and specific relief. In May, on an evening when the apple trees that someone had planted behind the old trading post years ago were in full bloom, white and fragrant in the warm spring air, Ira asked Evelyn to marry him. He did not do it with a great production. He was not a man of great productions. He did it in the garden behind the store in the apple tree smell of the May evening, and he said, simply and directly, "I want to marry you. I want to build a life here with you in this place that you built, and I want to do it properly and permanently, if you will have me." She looked at the apple blossoms for a moment, then she looked at him. She said, "I was wondering when you were going to get there." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That is an absolute yes, Ira Carver. You have been courting me since October, and it is now May, and a woman can only be patient for so long." He kissed her under the apple trees as the evening came in over the valley, warm and sure, the kind of kiss that is not a beginning or a question but a statement of fact. They were married in June 1885, on a Saturday in the church that the community had built on 3 Saturdays in the summer of 1882, with the fiddle player from Christmas playing something slow and tender as Evelyn came through the door, in a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Pueblo, ivory cotton with small embroidered flowers at the cuffs, which Clara Dwight had helped her select from the catalog, and which was, everyone agreed, exactly right for her. The whole town was there. Samuel Holt stood beside Ira. Clara Dwight stood beside Evelyn. The children from the school had been promised by Clara that if they sat quietly during the ceremony, they could throw apple blossoms, which had been saved and dried for exactly this purpose, and they did both things with admirable dedication. The minister, a man named Reverend Adkins, who had arrived in Callen in the spring of 1883, and who had a good-natured understanding of the valley's particular history, performed the ceremony with warmth and a minimum of unnecessary length. When Ira and Evelyn exchanged their vows, they had written their own, which was slightly unusual for the time but which Reverend Adkins had encouraged because he was, as he said, a great believer in people saying specifically what they meant. Evelyn said to Ira, "I promise to trust you with my choices and to trust that you will trust me with yours. I promise to build with you and not for you or despite you. I promise to tell you when I am afraid and to let you tell me the same. I promise to stay in every way that staying means for the rest of my life." Ira said to Evelyn, "I promise to stay. I promise it without qualification or escape clause, and in full understanding of what it means to make that promise to you specifically, which is that I am promising it to a woman who will absolutely hold me to it, and who has every right to do so. I promise to be useful to what you build and to support it, and to never again make a decision about what is best for you without first asking what you think about it. I promise to love you openly and honestly for every single day I have." There was not a dry eye in the church. The children threw the apple blossoms. The celebration afterward, held in the open field beside the church on the long June afternoon, was exactly what a celebration in a small frontier town in 1885 looked like when the whole town was genuinely happy. Tables of food brought by everyone, fiddle music that eventually expanded to include a man named Pete Riordan, who had a guitar and a voice that carried, dancing on the grass as the light went long and golden, and the particular cheerful noise of children who have been patient for hours and are now free to run. Ira danced with Evelyn twice before she said her feet needed a rest, and then they sat at the edge of the dancing and watched the town that she had made celebrate the life they were beginning together. And her hand was in his, and the valley spread out around them in the summer light, golden and alive, and entirely worth staying for. The life they built after the wedding was the kind that accumulates quietly and becomes, over years, something you look at and cannot believe you were lucky enough to have. Ira's horse operation grew steadily. By the summer of 1886, he had expanded to 20 breeding animals and had hired 2 men, one of whom was the son of a local farming family, and one of whom was a young man named Vicent Reyes who had come through the valley on his way from New Mexico and had stayed when Ira offered him honest work and a fair wage, which was, Vicent said, rarer than it should have been. Vicent became part of the Carver operation, and then part of the Carver household in the larger sense, the sense in which certain people become part of a family not through blood, but through proximity and shared work, and the particular affection that grows between people who spend long days doing hard things together. He was 23 and cheerful and deeply capable with horses, and he ate supper at the farmhouse often enough that Clara Dwight, when she started coming to Sunday suppers that Evelyn had begun hosting as a social institution for the unmarried people in the town, eventually began finding reasons to arrive early on the days Vicent was likely to be there. Evelyn noticed this before anyone else, as she noticed most things, and she said nothing and did nothing except make sure both of them were invited to the right things at the same time. By the winter of 1886, the situation between Clara and Vicent had progressed to the point where Samuel Holt, who had also noticed, said to Ira one morning at the livery, "Your house is becoming a matchmaking operation." Ira said, "It is Evelyn's house. She can run whatever kind of operation she likes in it." Samuel said, "That is a very sensible position." In the spring of 1887, Evelyn told Ira she was expecting a child. She told him on a morning in March when the frost was just beginning to ease, standing in the kitchen of the farmhouse with the stove lit and the coffee made, and she said it plainly, the way she said all important things. "I'm expecting. The baby should come in October." He went entirely still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and wrapped both arms around her, and she put her face against his neck, and they stood there in the kitchen warmth for a long time without saying anything because nothing needed to be said. The weight of the moment said it. He said finally, "Are you happy about it?" She said into his shoulder, "I am completely and unreservedly happy about it." "Are you?" he said. "I am so happy about it that I am having some difficulty breathing." She laughed. He felt it against his neck. The baby came on a night in mid-October when the first hard frost was on the valley, and the stove in the bedroom was going full, and Samuel Holt had been dispatched to fetch the midwife, a competent and calm woman named Ada Bell who had been managing Callen's arrivals and departures, medically speaking, for 3 years. Clara Dwight was there because Evelyn had asked for her, and Ira sat in the kitchen with Samuel and Vicent and endured the particular anguish of being male and useful at nothing in the moments that mattered, until Ada Bell opened the bedroom door and said, in the tone of a woman reporting good news as a matter of routine, "Healthy boy. Mother is doing well. You can come in." He was through the door before she finished the sentence. The boy was small and red-faced and apparently furious about his recent change of address, and he was the most extraordinary thing Ira had ever seen. Evelyn was propped against the pillows with her dark hair loose and her face tired and incandescent, and she was looking at the baby with the expression of a woman who has just done the most difficult thing of her life and found that it was exactly what she expected and better than she imagined simultaneously. She looked up when Ira came in and held the baby toward him. He took him with the careful terror of a man who has worked with animals all his life and understands, suddenly, that this is an entirely different category of living thing. He said, "He's angry," she said. "He just arrived. Give him a minute." They named him Thomas James Carver, Thomas for Ira's father, James because Evelyn had always liked the name, and because it was simple and strong and suited the way he was already holding his fists. The town received Thomas with the collective warmth of a small community that takes its children seriously. Samuel Holt arrived the next morning with a wooden cradle he had been secretly making for 2 months. Clara Dwight arrived with food. Reverend Adkins arrived with a blessing and a bottle of good whiskey, which he gave to Ira and said was for medicinal purposes in the broadest possible sense. Thomas was christened in the church on a Sunday in November with the whole town present, because in Callen, Colorado Territory, in the year 1887, births and marriages and deaths were community events in the truest sense, because community in a small frontier town was not a sentiment, it was a practical structure, the thing that kept you going when the winter was hard and the nearest city was 2 days' ride. The years that followed were full. Not dramatically full, not the full of crisis and conflict that the earlier years had been, but the full of a life that is genuinely alive, layered with the small events and large feeling of people who are exactly where they have chosen to be. Ira's horse operation continued to grow, and by 1889, when Colorado moved toward statehood, the Carver horses had a reputation across 3 counties that made the operation genuinely profitable. He had 5 men working for him by then, including Vicent, who had married Clara Dwight in a ceremony at the Callen Church in the summer of 1888 that had been smaller and quieter than Ira and Evelyn's and completely perfect. Evelyn had sold the general store to a family named the Aldridges, who had come to Callen in 1887 and who were well suited to running it, because Evelyn had recognized in herself, honestly and without sentiment, that the store had been the tool she needed to build the town, and that the town was now built and needed something else from her. What she turned to was a combination of things. She continued to be deeply involved in the civic life of Callen, on various committees, and as a frequently consulted voice on matters of town policy. But she also began writing, something she had done privately for years, observations and documentation, and the kind of precise, analytical description of life that turns out to be valuable when a territory is becoming a state and people begin to want records of how places came to be. She began corresponding with the Colorado Territorial Historical Society in 1888, and her documentation of the Callen founding and the Morse prosecution became, eventually, part of the official historical record of the region. She also began writing for the Denver Tribune on an occasional basis, pieces about frontier settlement and land law and the experience of women who had built in the West, which were received with some surprise and considerable readership, because she wrote with the same direct, undefended clarity with which she spoke, and it turned out that people appreciated that. She read her pieces to Ira in the evenings after Thomas was in bed, and he listened the way he had always listened to her, with full attention and genuine engagement, and he said one evening, when she had read him a particularly precise piece about the mechanics of how Morse had operated and what it had taken to bring him down, "You should collect these into a book," she said. "That seems like a large undertaking." He said, "You have built a town from nothing. A book seems manageable." She said, "That is absurd reasoning." He said, "But," she said after a moment, "but I have been thinking about it." In 1890, Colorado achieved statehood, and in the celebrations at the church that November, Callen's small community toasted their valley and the state it was now part of, and Evelyn stood at the front of the gathering and gave a speech that she had not written out because she did not need to, about what the valley had been, and what it had become, and what it had cost, and what it was worth. And Ira stood at the back of the church and listened to her and felt, as he had felt many times in the years since he had ridden down from the ridge and found her standing in front of her store, the particular awe of a man who is regularly confronted with the scope of the person he loves. Thomas, who was 3 years old and had recently developed strong opinions about everything, announced loudly from the middle of the crowd that he was hungry, which broke the emotional moment entirely and made everyone laugh, including Evelyn, who found his son where he was standing and said, "We will eat in approximately 5 minutes if you can manage it." And Thomas indicated through his expression that this was barely acceptable. Clara and Vicent Reyes welcomed their first child in early 1891, a girl they named Rosa, and she became Thomas's primary companion in the way that children in small communities become companions, by proximity and frequency, and the natural tendency of small people to seek each other out. Evelyn was present for Rosa's birth, and Claire said afterward that having Evelyn there had made her less afraid, because there was something about Evelyn Barrett in a crisis, even a happy crisis, that made things seem manageable. In the spring of 1891, Evelyn found out she was expecting again. She told Ira on a morning in April, in the kitchen, in the same direct way she had told him about Thomas, and he had the same involuntary inability to breathe, and she laughed at him for it in the same fond, clear way, and they were both very happy. That summer, while she was expecting and therefore doing rather less riding and rather more sitting at her desk writing, she began the book. She called it tentatively A Valley Under Pressure, Land, Law, and Community in the Colorado Frontier, which Ira said was a good title and completely accurate and would possibly stop a few people from reading it who might otherwise have been interested. She said, "Who would I be stopping from reading it?" He said, "People who want the story." She thought about that. She said, "There is a story in it." He said, "There is a very good story in it with a remarkable woman at the center of it." She looked at him across the desk. She said, "Are you flattering me?" He said, "I am stating facts." She said, "Flattery and facts are not mutually exclusive." The second baby came in late October 1891, another October baby, which Ira said meant they were clearly autumn people, and it was a girl, small and dark-haired like her mother, and the midwife Ada Bell noted with professional approval, considerably less furious about her arrival than Thomas had been. They named her Ruth Ira Carver. Ira for Evelyn's mother, whose name she had not spoken aloud in some time, and which she said while she held her new daughter with the soft, complex emotion of a person naming a grief and a love at once. Thomas was 4 when Ruth arrived and took his new role as older brother with a seriousness that made Evelyn say to Ira one evening, "He has your exact expression when he's decided something is his responsibility." Ira said, "He also has your exact expression when someone is not listening carefully enough and he is about to make them." She said, "That is an excellent quality." He said, "I have always thought so." By 1892, Callen had grown to a proper small town of 140 residents, with the general store, the mill, the school, 2 churches now, the second a small Methodist congregation that had organized itself and built a neat little building on the south side of the road, a doctor's office, a telegraph office, a proper post office, and 3 ranching operations of which Ira's was the largest and most established. The road to the nearest rail junction had been improved to the point of being reliable in most weather, and the valley was, by any reasonable measure, a thriving going concern. Ira stood on the ridge one late afternoon in October 1892, the same ridge he had stood on 8 years earlier when he had ridden back into the valley and seen it for the first time since he had left it. He had come up here specifically, on a clear afternoon with the valley in the long autumn light, because he wanted to see it from this angle again. He wanted to see it the way he had seen it the first time, from outside, from above, from the perspective of a man who had expected nothing and found everything. The wheat fields still ran gold in the autumn. There was the school and the 2 churches and the mill. There was the general store, the Aldridges, now, but still the building she had made into a cornerstone. There was his own farm at the east end, the good barn and the new fencing and the horses he could see moving in the pasture from here, small and purposeful from this distance. He heard hoofbeats behind him and turned. Evelyn came up the trail on her mare, which she had taken back to riding with her characteristic capability now that Ruth was a year old, and Evelyn's body had firmly declared itself ready to be put to use again. She pulled up beside him and looked out at the valley. She said, "Thomas told me you had come up here. He was slightly concerned about you." Ira said, "Thomas is 4 years old and concerned about me," she said. "He is very responsible." He looked at the valley and then at her. He said, "I was standing here thinking about the first time I saw this from up here, when I came back." She said, "And," he said, "I thought I was coming back to a place I had failed. I thought I would find exactly what I had left, which was a struggling hollow that had never quite managed to become something. I thought I would find, maybe, a ruin I could at least tend." She said, "Instead you found this." He said, "Instead I found this. Instead I found you, standing in front of your store, directing your hired men with your ledger in your arm." He looked at her. "I was devastated, Evelyn. For about 3 full minutes on this ridge I was completely devastated because it meant I couldn't use the image of a ruined place to justify what I had done by leaving, because the place wasn't ruined. You had made it extraordinary." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And after the 3 minutes," he said, "and after the 3 minutes I rode down into the valley anyway." She said, "I know, I'm glad." He said, "So am I." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. He held it. They looked at the valley in the autumn light, at the thing that had been built, at the life that was happening in it, at the children who were in it and the people who were in it, and the years of work and hope and stubbornness and love that had gone into every building and field and road of it. He said, "You made this worth staying for." She looked at him. She said, "We made it worth staying for. You have been here 8 years, Ira. You have been part of this for 8 years. He said, "You made it something worth coming back to." That came first. She considered that. She said, "All right, I will accept that." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The book was published in 1893 by a small Denver press that had been started by a woman who had read Evelyn's Tribune pieces and written to her directly. A Valley Under Pressure came out in the spring with a print run of 500 copies, which sold out within 2 months. And the Denver Tribune ran a piece about it that called it the most honest account of frontier land law and community building to come out of the Colorado settlement period, which Evelyn read aloud to Ira one morning with the careful, slightly embarrassed pleasure of a person who is not entirely sure they deserve the thing they have been given but is trying to accept it gracefully. Ira said, "You deserve every word of it," she said. "You are contractually obligated to say that." He said, "I was saying it before there was a contract." She smiled. The full smile, not the almost smile, the one he had been working for since October of 1884, which he had by now accumulated enough of to know that it never stopped being worth working for. The press wanted a second book. She was already thinking about it. Thomas started school in the autumn of 1893 and took to it with the intensity of a child who has been waiting for this specific thing and finds it exactly as satisfying as expected. Clara Dwight taught him, and she told Evelyn privately that he was exceptional, not only clever but the specific combination of curious and persistent that made a child genuinely educable in the deepest sense. And Evelyn had received this information with the contained, radiant pride of a mother trying not to make too much of it. Ira coached Thomas in the evening sometimes, on reading and simple arithmetic, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp lit, and Evelyn would come through from the parlor where she had been writing and stand in the doorway watching them without either of them knowing she was there. Her son's dark head bent over a book and her husband's large hand showing him something on the page. And the feeling that came over her in those moments was one she had no clean word for. Only the sense of a life that was full and real, and exactly worth every day of the work it had taken to build it. Ruth was 2.5 by the autumn of 1893 and had developed the specific imperious quality of a younger child who has worked out that she is considered charming and has begun using this strategically. Ira said she was going to be formidable. Evelyn said she already was. They both said it with complete admiration. In December of 1893, on the evening before Christmas, the family was at home in the farmhouse with the lamps lit, and the stove going and the smell of the pine they had brought in from the ridge perfuming the rooms. Thomas was asleep. Ruth was asleep. The house was quiet with the particular quiet of a house that has been full of children and is now in its temporary evening rest. And Evelyn was at her desk writing, and Ira was reading in the chair by the stove, which was what they did on many winter evenings, and the comfort of it was so complete it was almost physical. Evelyn put down her pen and came to sit on the arm of his chair, which was something she did sometimes when she was tired of the desk and not ready for bed, and he put his arm around her automatically without looking up from his book, and she leaned against him and looked at the fire in the stove through its glass door, and she said, "I have been thinking about a title for the next book." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I want to write about the women. The specific experience of women who built in the West, not just this valley but broadly, what it cost and what it looked like and what it made possible." He said, "That is the most important book you could write." She said, "You think so?" He said, "I know so. There are 100 accounts of men who built in the West. I do not know of a single account that is honest about what the women who built alongside them actually did and endured." She said, "There are some." He said, "There should be more, and yours would be better than the ones that exist." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you, Ira." He looked up from the book. She was looking at the stove with the firelight on her face, and she looked exactly like herself, which was the thing he loved most about her, that she had never tried to be anything other than exactly herself. Not in any year he had known her, not when it was easy and not when it was very hard. He said, "I love you, Evelyn, completely." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the December dark pressed against the windows, and the valley was covered in snow, and somewhere in the rooms above them, their children were sleeping in the life they had been given, and everything was whole and real, and worth every piece of the long road it had taken to get here. In the spring of 1894, Evelyn found on a morning in March that she was expecting a third child. She told Ira at the kitchen table in the same direct way she always told him things, and he had once again the involuntary inability to breathe, and she laughed at him for it with the warm, clear laugh of a woman who knows a person exactly and finds them wonderful. She said, "You would think you would be accustomed to this by now." He said, "I will never be accustomed to it." She said, "Good." The third child came in October 1894, another October baby. Ira said this was simply who they were now, and it was a boy, solid and loud and magnificent. They named him Samuel James Carver, Samuel for Samuel Holt, who had been a friend and steady presence in their lives for a decade now, and who, when he was told the name, went very quiet and looked at the floor for a moment and then said, clearing his throat, "That is a fine name. That is a very fine name." Thomas was 7 when Samuel was born and had already begun demonstrating a natural ease with younger children that suggested he was going to be the kind of older sibling who teaches rather than torments, which Evelyn said was Ira's doing. Ira said, "He is entirely your doing." She said, "We are going to argue about this forever." He said, "Probably." She said, "Good." The Callen of 1895 was not the Hollow of 1878, and it was not the incorporated town of 1881, and it was not even quite the growing community of 1887. It was a proper small town in a proper state, with a decade and a half of accumulated history and the specific character, that grows when a community has been through something together and come out the other side intact. There were old-timers who remembered Morse and what the valley had been before Evelyn Barrett arrived with her 2 jugs at the creek and her box of books, and her infuriating certainty that a struggling place was not a lost place. There were newcomers who had arrived in the years since and who had never known the hollow before the town, and who might not have known the story if Evelyn had not written it down. There were children who had been born here, Thomas and Ruth and Samuel Carver, Rosa Reyes and her younger brother Miguel, and the Aldridge children, and half a dozen others, who knew no other home and who would grow up in the valley as something it had made rather than something it had tested. On an afternoon in late September 1895, Ira was working in the east pasture with Vicent, checking the fence line before the autumn roundup, and Vicent said, in the contemplative tone of a man following a thought he had been having for a while, "You know what I was thinking about this morning?" Ira said. "What?" Vicent said. "I was thinking about when I came through this valley the first time on my way north and you offered me the work. I almost didn't stay. I was going to say no." Ira said, "Why did you say yes?" Vicent said. "Because you paid me fairly and you looked at me like a man and not like a problem." He was quiet for a moment. "And because the valley looked like a place something was happening." Ira said, "It did." Vicent said, "It still does." Ira looked out across the east pasture at the horses moving in the September afternoon, at the farmhouse and barn at the valley below, and the mountains above and the town in the middle distance, alive with the ordinary gorgeous activity of a place where people had chosen to make a life. He said, "Yes, it still does." That evening, Evelyn put the children to bed and came out to the porch where Ira was sitting in the cooler air of the early autumn evening, watching the last of the light leave the valley. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the bench he had built for the porch the previous summer, and they sat together in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have been together long enough that quiet is not absence but presence. She said after a while, "I have been thinking about something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have been thinking that this valley, the way it is now, the way it has been for the last several years, is exactly what I believed it could be back in 1878 when I first arrived. I believed that a place that was struggling was not a lost place. I believed it with an absolute certainty that probably looked foolish to everyone around me." She paused. "And I was right." He said, "You were," she said. "I was not wrong about it being possible, but I was in certain moments very lonely in the believing of it." She looked at him sideways. "You are the reason the rest of my life has not been lonely in that way." He said, "You are the reason the rest of my life has a point." She said, "That is a very romantic thing to say." He said, "I have been practicing for 11 years. She laughed. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat on the porch in the darkening valley, with the children sleeping inside and the horses in the pasture, and the town visible in its lamps and windows down the road, and the mountains standing over everything in the old, reliable way that mountains stand, indifferent to human trouble and entirely beautiful anyway. And the life they had built was around them and inside them and between them, solid and warm and real. He said quietly in the dark, "I am glad I came back." She said just as quietly, "I am glad you came back too, though you made me wait a very long time for it." He said, "I know." She said, "You are forgiven." "You have been forgiven for quite some time. I just did not always tell you." He said, "When did you decide to forgive me?" She thought about it. She said, "The Sunday evening when you came to tell me about Hennessy. You could have said nothing. You came and told me anyway." She was quiet. "That was when I knew you had learned the thing you needed to learn." He said, "What thing?" She said, "That the way to protect someone you love is not to make decisions for them. It is to bring them the information and let them decide." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." They sat in the dark until the coffee was gone and the valley was all lamps and stars. And then they went inside to the warmth and the sleeping children and the life they had made together in this valley that had been nothing and was now everything. And every door was closed, and every fire was banked for the night, and every debt was paid and nothing was left unsaid. And the morning would come with its ordinary, extraordinary gifts, the coffee and the children and the horses in the pasture. And Evelyn Barrett Carver, who had built this place from nothing, would be there in it. And Ira Carver, who had come home, would be there in it. And all of it was worth every step of the long road both of them had taken to arrive.